My paper actually talks about several policies that have been implemented, whether deliberately or tacitly, in DC, that actually, instead of addressing the problems that they try to address, they exacerbate them. One of the policies, which is sort of spreading around the country and being curbed at the same time in places that have noticed it, like LA and New York. Condoms are being used as evidence of solicitation or prostitution or related activities. Often, these condoms are distributed by a local Department of Health. That's the situation in DC. I have condoms there that say, this. What does it say? This condom is legal?
Do not confiscate. There you go. So there's an opportunity for a condom ad.
Wait, it's not working?
Yep,
No,
we got printouts. Oh, that one?
All right.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, thank you. All right, this is the civil rights issue of the future, the rights of sex workers. It's the new queer. So what I'm addressing today is, like I said, it's introductory. It's the recent conflation of sex work and sex trafficking and labor trafficking that has been occurring in our public discourse. And just to take a step back and put it in perspective. Do I in here or here? Or what did I do?
You broke it. There we go.
All right. So the word whore. Who are we calling a whore? Why do we call people whores? Does anybody know an actual whore that would, be able to be classified under any of these, whatever it is that you're going to throw out? Who do we call a whore these days? Like, why would you call somebody a whore? Or why would you criminalize prostitution? If that's a better way to phrase it. What are some of the reasons this is done? Anyone?
Public safety.
There you go. And you would be referring to
venereal diseases.
What's the threat? Okay, the threat is a health threat.
Underground, creepy activity.
All right. What else? What else?
I don't subscribe to this, but some would say it's immoral to allow such activity in a society where we're trying to promote monogamy, marriage, or whatever.
So everybody should act right, says the state.
So yeah, it's a moral objection to it.
All right. Does anybody have any other reasons? Maybe, who would be so desperate as to do this? Poverty, maybe? Or money troubles would encourage somebody maybe to do something that ordinarily most people would think nobody should be doing. That's you, Robert. A victim. Oftentimes we think, well, this person is either a drug addict or they were often abused when they were young and that's why they're acting out in this way. They are too young to give consent and therefore they're incapacitated. But they're a victim of some sort.
Or coerced.
Or coerced, thank you. Or a person whose civil and human rights are subservient to a patriarchal system. This is what so-called radical feminists are advancing these days as far as why they're trying to abolish the many, many people that are in trafficking these days. And speaking of which, what kinds of trafficking are there, if there are types of trafficking?
Labor trafficking.
Okay, out of these two, which is more prevalent?
Labor.
Okay, how many people say sex trafficking is more prevalent and a bigger problem? Okay, how many people say labor? Who cheats? Oh, well, I've asked many people, and many people are under the impression that, and I would say that just people in general are under the impression that sex trafficking is this huge problem. We don't hear a whole lot about labor trafficking, which is quite prevalent if we take the State Department's numbers to be true. For the first time this year, they have actually come out and said in their trafficking persons report, came out in July, I believe, that labor trafficking is more prevalent than sex trafficking is, but you don't hear about it all that much. So with that, do people remember a time when the word sex trafficking didn't come into your attention every day, or at least every week? Was it always like this? Did we always talk about sex trafficking? Okay. Well, I remember that around the year 2000, it started coming up in pop culture. There's a movie whose name I can't remember that came out in the early aughts. There have been since TV series, more movies that talk about sex trafficking. Certainly the situation in the Balkans was a situation where the US government and the US military was implicated heavily in funding, either directly or indirectly, the trafficking of large, massive, thousands of women overseas. And it was around the year 2000 that this started happening because of the Bush administration, who came together with evangelicals and the so-called radical feminists, and they decided to, and I have citations for all this, so if you want them, I'll give them to you at some other point. They decided that a good way to combat prostitution in general, which is voluntary, not coerced, sex work, would be to take advantage of this globalization of the market economy and this growing phenomenon of labor trafficking and roll it up into a big ball with sex work and with sex trafficking. Are you able to read the stats that are in that handout that I gave you? Well, on there you will see in some portion that there's several different estimates as to how much trafficking there is worldwide. Some people say, or some organizations, NGOs and government as well, say 27 million, some say 800,000, some say 300,000, some say 17,500. And a good question would be, with all this, all these growing numbers, all these, no matter what number you pick, it's still a pretty alarming number. Nobody should be forced to do anything that they don't want to do, much less be removed from everything that they're familiar with. At this day and age, it's just unthinkable almost. But how are we doing in all these efforts? There's been a lot of funding coming from Google, for example, dropped a few million recently on anti-trafficking efforts for Blair's Project and some other organizations. DOJ gives a lot of grant money in organizations that will work in this problem, as well as the State Department. It is estimated, and I have stats with citations if you want them, it's estimated that we spend about $400,000 a year in the US per person who we take out of a situation that is a confirmed trafficking situation. 400,000, it's not to say that you can put a price on a human life, but 400,000 per rescued person, there might be a better way of doing things. I don't know. So for example, when Department of Justice reported in 2006 how the implementation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 had been going, they reported on numbers from 2001 to 2005. They reported that their prosecutions for trafficking had increased 300%. But when you look at the 300%, it's a total of 91 cases that were prosecuted between the years 2001 and 2006 under the TVPA. So 91 cases out of the 17,500 to 50,000 on the low end of trafficked persons in the US every year is an indication of how well we're doing in combating the trafficking situation. So, what is prostitution? Also known as sex work. The exchange of sexual favors, however broadly or narrowly defined the sexual favors are, for money or other consideration. And it is understood there that this is consensual, non-coerced, not forced. Whereas sex trafficking means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. This is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So at the essence of trafficking is coercion, force, manipulation, or putting somebody in a situation where they're not acting of their own free will. So how this becomes conflated with prostitution then stops making sense to people unless you subscribe to the view that all prostitution is, by definition, coerced or forced. But then this puts the sex worker, there are a lot of sex workers, and if you remember the background for a couple of slides ago where there was a world map and a bunch of umbrellas, those umbrellas represent sex workers, rights organizers, and organizations around the world. And they're growing, they're increasingly more organized and more networked, and one of their biggest pet peeves is that they do what they do unforced, uncoerced. And they don't appreciate when people say automatically, well, you're a prostitute, you're a victim. You couldn't possibly be doing this out of your own free will. You need to be rescued, you need to be rehabilitated. We need to take you out of whatever life you decided to make for yourself and tell you what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Abroad, a lot of our US money goes to funding NGOs that actually they do raids on brothels, the raid and rescue model. They raid brothels to liberate all the women that are in there, and they put them in a rehabilitation facility, sort of not a halfway house, but they say, you know, this is a really great place that we have, it's safe, they're away from their captors, and more often you're getting reports of women that break out of the rehabilitation centers because they feel that they have even fewer liberties in there than they did when they were working in a brothel. So, to make the point again that sexual slavery isn't necessarily related hand in hand the same thing as trafficking, and when it comes to labor, 500 Indian workers were brought to the US to work in shipyards after Katrina. They're suing the several companies that were involved in bringing them here to work in the shipyard, alleging that they were brought to the country under a false premise, they lived in deplorable conditions, and they were under threats of violence. But the shipyard business is still regulated. It's not criminalized. They're probably looking at different ways of managing shipyards so that these incidents of labor trafficking don't happen again. But we haven't outlawed the shipyard industry, nor agriculture, nor fake nails, nor, you know, butchered food, butchered meat. So the irony of the situation would be that the more money you throw at law enforcement to go after traffickers and their victims, the more people end up in jail, and not the traffickers necessarily. I mean, not the traffickers hardly ever. Yeah, okay, this is my most boring slide of the entire presentation. So, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. When somebody is found to be in a situation where they were being trafficked, they were being held captive against their will, the TVPA allows for them to apply for a T visa. Or to give it, they grant T visas in order for the person to be able to then apply for permanent residence. To qualify for that visa, as the slide says, the victim has the burden of showing conclusive proof that her attacker intended to exploit her. Not to go into it too deeply, but if you're being detained, it's kind of hard to gather evidence in order to show conclusively that your attacker or your captor was intending to exploit you. Whether you have friendly witnesses that you can try to get in contact with or not, you're still putting yourself at potential danger for bringing certain people to the witness stand or to testify. What happens to them if they're, you know, on the outside and so are your captors? You're putting them in danger as well, and you're not necessarily going to prove your point. And the victim also can't just free herself and go running to law enforcement and say, I've been trafficked, help me, I just got out. Because it has to be certifiable. The police have to be the ones that get you out of your situation, or any of the NGOs that are funded by the government to work in this capacity. One of them would have to sort of basically certify that you were indeed trafficked. And she probably wouldn't get a T visa. So, that's actually a billboard that was put up for a day in LA by an NGO called Sway, Sex Workers, Allies, Activists, and You, which is awareness for people that are not in the sex trade. So domestic sex trafficking has been debunked as a phenomenon that increases whenever there's a sports event. It's not increasing at the exponential rates that we keep seeing and the disparate numbers, which is not to say that it doesn't happen. We used to call them missing and exploited children, runaways, and at some point we started calling them trafficked children. And it's always been a problem. So it's neither going away and it's not getting worse and worse and worse. There's the evidence that was used to shut down Craigslist erotic services and Backpage.com has been shown not to be anything that could be used to really say, well, this person is a suspected child. Let me bug Dean Broderick with this. So,
Thank you.
a picture of you right now would classify as a suspected child traffic, trafficked child, because you're holding a lollipop. If you had been wearing pigtails, you also would have made it into the list of ads that were suspect of child trafficking.
It's quite an image.
And it's not alleviated by heavy policing. Like I mentioned earlier, all we are doing is getting more people into jail. More likely than not, those people are low income, they're women, they're of color. A lot of queer people are getting trapped in this net too, transgendered people. And it's not really, it doesn't appear to be solving any problems statistically. So federal law does distinguish between trafficking and smuggling. There are two distinct activities, but during the Bush administration, the government gradually moved in the direction of linking all commercial sex to trafficking, as I've mentioned. Before the Bush administration came in, it was actually Hillary Clinton that was working with the UN in helping them draft the, I forget the name of it now, but it was their big piece of proclamation, policy, whatever you want to call it, to address trafficking. It wasn't the convention yet. Anyway, it was Hillary Clinton that was working on this, and she had the liberal feminist view, and she was trying to advance that view that you should absolutely not, you should decouple trafficking and sex work because it makes for all kinds of problems, inefficiency, conflating, going after unnecessarily going after activities, prosecutorial indiscretions, and such. And she almost completely got her way. The TVPA mostly reflects the separation between these two. And for the first time ever this year, like I said, she did actually say, all of the countries that we give a scorecard, or that have a scorecard in this report, you guys should not equate sex work with trafficking, regardless of whether we, the US, actually do that or not. You all should not. And prohibition, it tends to be a failure. The crime, the related crime associated with sex work is neither increased nor decreased by making, it's actually increased. The biggest indicator of a black market or illicit activity is whether there's a statute that criminalizes the activity. So you're creating problems when you prohibit certain vices instead of regulate them, bring them out into the open where everybody can see them. So many people have advocated for the Swedish model, which is the criminalization of being the purchaser of sex instead of being the provider. And any way that you look at it, you're still deeming an aspect of a sex work transaction to be criminal. So it's going to have downstream effects, criminalizing it at least half of the equation. So some women in Sweden, some sex workers in Sweden, many sex workers in Sweden actually are reporting that. They're worried that they're going to have less time to carry out their basic safety precautions, meaning vetting a client, which can be time consuming, depending on how thoroughly they vet their clients to see whether it's that they're armed at that moment or if they're going to go as far as verifying that they work where they say that they work in the capacity that they say that they work. They're still going to have less time to do this because there's some, they're the guy's putting his neck out there as far as being somebody who's about to purchase sexual favors. Street workers will be deterred from working in more public and better lit areas, which is not to say that they actually, the work part, when I say the work part, I don't mean the actual transaction, I mean the advertising that comes before it. So they have less time, I mean, they have fewer places to do this where they're actually safe in their work environment. Because it's illegal in Sweden as part of the criminalizing the purchaser policy, part of what the sex workers can't do is rent an apartment for the purposes of working out of that apartment. So now you have men that rent out apartments and exploit women who are trying to find a place to work. So you have basically what they call rent pimps or apartment pimps. The sex workers are incentivized to protect their clients from getting caught, because where is it that they're making their livelihood from? Why would they want them to get arrested? Oh, those letters didn't animate. All right, so if you look at the last page of your handout, there are 2 bar graphs, I think they're called. This is the Ohio State Attorney General came out with a study for this year's trafficking numbers in Ohio, saying that if you see the first bar in that bar graph is law enforcement. They represent the largest number of people who are purchasers of sex work that was done. I think the first one is, what is it? By manipulation, sorry. And they're also the biggest purveyors of victims trafficked by force. So you're giving them an incentive to go and do whatever it is that they want to do, because they're obviously empowered. Who's going to police them? And you're creating a situation where the sex worker has no recourse. He can't go to anybody to say, this guy's, extorting me. They're going to say, well, what you're doing is illegal. We're not going to help you. And, oh, there it is. Another example, 2004, DC got $450,000 from the Department of Justice to fight human trafficking and assist victims. If you look at Metro Police and their reporting of crime every year, they don't even have a category to put trafficking under. So I don't think anybody's too worried about where the $450,000 went. I actually have a couple of anecdotes as far as how that goes, but you might have to ask me later because I'm done.